The man arrived in the village without notice, as if the wind had carried him along the dusty road and left him at the edge of town. No one remembered seeing him approach. No one remembered his first step across the square. Yet he was there, moving quietly among the market stalls, his presence neither welcomed nor resisted. Children glanced at him briefly, then returned to their games, while merchants muttered over coins, feeling only a faint disquiet in the air. He was ordinary in every sense, hair neither dark nor light, eyes neither piercing nor dull, hands unremarkable, a face that seemed both remembered and forgotten simultaneously. To see him was to see nothing, and therein lay the terror. People noticed first that dogs behaved strangely around him. They did not bark, they did not growl. They simply watched, ears flattened, eyes wide, as if they recognized some truth the humans could not perceive. Villagers dismissed it as coincidence. Some whispered about old superstitions, saying he carried the weight of a curse. Others claimed it was merely luck or misjudgment, yet the unease remained, lingering like a cold mist at dawn. He did not speak unless necessary, and when he did, his words were precise, measured, and devoid of flourish. Greetings were polite but devoid of warmth. Requests were delivered with quiet efficiency. No laughter escaped him, no anger, no joy. His silence was not shyness, nor was it humility. It was a deliberate absence, a void that made the simplest act, handing a basket of grain, fetching water, repairing a fence, feel charged with something unnameable. Some villagers tried to remember him, attempting to pin the man down in memory. His hair, dark or streaked with gray, his face, thin, round, ordinary. Contradictions arose like smoke from a fire they could not see. Each description collapsed under scrutiny. Witnesses disagreed even with themselves. He was 100 impressions, none solid, none lasting, and yet, in the quiet corners of the village, hints of him clung to perception like shadows. A faint metallic scent on freshly washed clothes, a mark on a wrist, crescent-shaped, too deliberate for accident, a subtle stillness in the fields as he passed beneath the sun. No one accused him, no one thought to. Suspicion requires contrast, and he offered none. He did not draw attention, did not command it, did not ask for it. And so he moved among them, a living absence, a man who could vanish into the backdrop of everyday life while observing everything. And in the spaces between their glances, in the corners of their awareness, they did not dare examine too closely. He began to calculate, not out of malice, at least not at first, but out of a hunger that demanded a channel. The quiet devotion to what was ordinary would soon twist. The ordinary would become a mask, and the mask a tool, and in the silence of the village, in the shadows cast by their ignorance, he would wait. For now he was invisible, for now he was unnoticed, and the village continued its daily routines, unaware that the presence among them carried the weight of something unthinkable, a patient observer, a slow storm forming behind ordinary eyes. Weeks passed, and the village remained unaware of the quiet calculations unfolding in their midst. The man's presence, though still unremarkable, had begun to shape the lives around him in ways no one could name. He watched her, the woman whose laughter seemed too bright for the dim streets, whose kindness pierced the everyday fog, not openly, not with desire alone, but with a devotion so precise it became an obsession. Every glance, every gesture, every whispered insult she endured from her family was catalogued. Every slight, every whispered word of disdain or mockery was stored like fuel in a furnace no one could see. It started small. At the market, he carried heavier baskets than necessary, offering to shoulder part of her burden without a word. Her mother's sharp whispers, meant to shame, landed instead on him, absorbed silently. Her brother's sneer, his contemptuous glance, the sting of spit at his feet, all of it filed away in the quiet chambers of his mind. Villagers noticed his patience, his endurance, yet they mistook it for humility. They could not see the storm coiling beneath the calm, the fire flickering behind ordinary eyes. Then came the first disappearance. A man who had mocked too openly failed to return from a routine hunt. Villagers searched the woods in panic, calling his name until their voices broke, but found nothing. Only the abandoned rifle leaned neatly against a tree, a pair of boots resting side by side near the riverbank. No blood, no struggle, no sign of resistance, just absence. Whispers spread, but the villagers dared not accuse the quiet man. He was still there among them, tending to ordinary chores, carrying water, repairing fences. And yet, unseen, he had acted. The next act was subtler. Her sister, proud and sharp-tongued, vanished from her room without a trace. The bed left perfectly made, window latched, no footprints on the floor. Panic and despair filled the household, but no suspicion fell on him. He continued to serve, fetching meals and water, his face the same mask of ordinariness. To the family, the world seemed to have gone mad. To him, it was balance restored. Every act of cruelty inflicted upon him, every humiliation, every word of derision, had been answered, silently, precisely, and without witness. With each disappearance, his control grew. He measured the world by devotion and justice, by the scales of insult and retribution no one else could see. He whispered her name as he worked, using it to steady the trembling hands that carried vengeance in silence. The village began to fear nightfall without knowing why, avoiding streets they once walked freely. Windows were shuttered, doors bolted, candles burned long into the night. Shadows lengthened and twisted in ways that unsettled even the bravest men, yet the man remained unobtrusive, ordinary, a fixture as familiar as the rising sun. And through it all she noticed nothing, or perhaps she chose not to. She accepted his presence, relied on his help, unaware that the very hand that steadied her, that carried her burdens, had orchestrated the ruin of those who had harmed her. Love and obsession had merged into something unrecognizable, a devotion that demanded destruction. And in that quiet, measured madness, the village slept uneasily, never suspecting that the storm had been there all along, hidden behind a face too ordinary to frighten, too familiar to question. Time passed, and the quiet man's presence became inseparable from her life. She could not remember mornings without him tending the hearth, evenings without him standing in the shadows, ready to lift a basket, carry a jug, or block the chill of loneliness. Yet the feeling that something was amiss gnawed at her, a subtle shift in air, a metallic tang that lingered in rooms where she had cried, a faint pattern that made her chest tighten. The vanishings, once distant rumors, now pressed close, and her family's absence left a hollow she could not ignore. She began to notice small details, a gleam in his eyes that did not belong to ordinary men, movements too precise, too deliberate. When he lifted a heavy basket, the sleeve of his coat would slip, revealing scars along his wrist, tiny crescent shapes, deliberate and human, like teeth marks. She remembered the story a hunter had told of the rideless horse, the abandoned boots, the perfectly folded nightdress. She put the fragments together quietly, like a puzzle too terrible to speak aloud. Each piece confirmed what her heart feared but refused to name. He had done it all, every disappearance, every punishment. Every shadowed consequence of her family's cruelty. Fear and pity warred within her. She recoiled from the realization even as a strange relief settled in. No, one else had been hurt. She understood then, with chilling clarity, that his violence had been a shield. The world outside was cruel, but he had bent that cruelty upon itself, sparing her. He had destroyed her tormentors in silence, leaving her as the sole survivor of a family that had mocked, humiliated, and belittled them both. And yet the cost weighed heavily. Her heart ached at the thought of lives ended, disappearances left unexplained, a darkness that had grown in tandem with his devotion. Still, she did nothing. She could not. To condemn him would mean condemning herself, for she had benefited from the results of his actions, even unknowingly. She felt the unspoken truth in her chest like a stone. Her safety, her peace, her very life had been carved from blood, and every act that had protected her had twisted his soul further. Each time she looked at him, she saw the man she had always trusted, the quiet figure who never demanded, who bore her burdens without complaint. But behind that mask the storm persisted, invisible to all but her. The villagers began to whisper again, but differently this time. Where once their talk had been scorn, now it was caution. Doors were locked, windows shuttered, and children were called inside before dusk. Fear had replaced mockery, yet suspicion never landed on him. He moved freely, ordinary in appearance, silent in demeanor, yet ever present. His devotion had transformed into something untouchable, something incomprehensible. She wrestled with conflicting emotions, terror at his power, gratitude for his protection, fascination at his dedication, and guilt for the blood that stained her unspoken safety. She began speaking to him in small ways, testing boundaries, watching for signs of the man who had orchestrated such precise ruin. Each glance he cast, each subtle action he took, confirmed her understanding. Yet she did not recoil. She could not. Fear and admiration intertwined, forging a bond that was equal parts dependence and complicity. And so life continued, strange and silent. She moved through the village with him nearby, aware yet outwardly unaware, holding a secret too heavy for speech. The world had shifted, yet remained unchanged for those who had not glimpsed the truth. And he, ever steady, ever quiet, continued to serve, to protect, and to love her in a devotion so dark that only the flicker of her gaze betrayed the horror of its reach. By the winter of 1834, silence had become the village's constant companion. The laughter that once drifted from her family's windows was gone. The yard lay still, the air thick with unease. Her house, once full of cruel voices, now held only echoes. And through it all he remained, steady, patient, as though nothing in the world had changed. To the villagers his loyalty seemed saintly. They whispered that he pitied her loneliness, that his heart was too kind to abandon her. None saw the truth that pulsed beneath that calm exterior. He moved through the rooms of her home like a ghost of her past, quietly repairing broken hinges, sweeping ash from the hearth, drawing water from the well where no one else dared to look. Each act of care carried an unseen weight. Each quiet moment stretched taut with unspoken knowledge. At times she watched him from the doorway, her hands trembling though she could not name why. The same scent that had haunted her dreams, the faint metallic tang that clung to rooms after each disappearance, still lingered on his clothes. She wanted to believe it was memory playing tricks, but she knew better. She had seen the scars, heard his breath catch when her family's names were spoken. She had noticed how his expression tightened at their mention, how his gaze softened when it turned toward her, and yet she said nothing. Her silence became its own form of devotion, an echo of his. To expose him would be to expose herself, to reveal that she had known, had understood, and had allowed the horror to unfold. To condemn him would mean acknowledging that part of her had wanted protection, had needed it, had accepted it even when it came at the cost of blood. When villagers spoke of curses and retribution, she nodded faintly, pretending to agree. When they said the house was haunted, she did not deny it. It was haunted, by the weight of mercy twisted into madness, by the devotion that had erased every cruel voice except hers. He continued his service without question. When neighbors turned her away, he stood by her door with food. When she wept, he waited in silence. She could feel his gaze, filled with a tenderness more terrible than violence, a love that had devoured an entire family to keep her untouched. At times, she wanted to scream, to drive him away, but the words never formed. The fear of solitude outweighed the horror of his presence. One evening, as the sun sank behind the withered trees, she caught him watching her with that same steady, unreadable calm. His eyes reflected both guilt and peace, as though he had accepted what he had become. She opened her mouth to speak, but stopped. There was nothing to say that could unmake the truth they both carried. And so the silence remained, a silence thicker than any prayer, heavier than any confession. It filled the house, settled into the walls, became part of the air they breathed. The villagers avoided the path that led to her gate, crossing themselves when the wind carried faint sounds from her yard, footsteps, perhaps, or something less certain. They never knew that the true horror was not in the acts committed but in the quiet that followed, the silence of a man who had killed for love and of a woman who understood yet chose to remain still. The story ended not with punishment or peace, but with endurance, a devotion so distorted it could no longer be separated from guilt. And somewhere beyond the edge of the fields, a faint voice carried on the wind, a whispered name spoken softly, over and over, like a prayer too late to save anyone. Years later, when the house of the Ward family was finally sold, the new owners began the slow task of restoration. Beneath warped floorboards in the cellar, they found a small chest iron-bound, sealed tight, and hidden beneath a layer of brick dust and cobweb. Inside, wrapped in rotted linen, were papers, dozens of them, each one written in the same careful, deliberate hand. The ink had faded to a reddish brown, the letters pressed so deep into the parchment it was as if the writer carved rather than wrote them. The first page bore no date, only the words, "For her sake." The entries that followed read not like confession, but like devotion transcribed. The writer spoke of endurance, of humiliation, of a love that demanded patience and sacrifice. There were no names, only she, them, and the debt. Yet the patterns were unmistakable, dates aligned with each disappearance, descriptions of boots by the river, of a window closed from within, of a stallion returning riderless. Each act justified as an offering a tithe to the altar of love. The tone grew darker with every page. They mocked her peace. One entry began, so I took from them the noise of their laughter. Another read, "Each silence I create becomes her comfort, each absence her protection." By the final pages, the writing trembled, lines fractured, ink blotted by what looked like rain or tears. I hear them at night, the writer confessed, the ones I sent into quiet. They stand at the foot of my bed, not accusing, but waiting. They whisper her name, not mine. A note pinned to the last entry carried a different hand finer, gentler, written in the script of a woman. "These are the writings of Jonas Hale," it said. "He was good once. What he became was born of love that rotted into madness. I leave these here not to condemn him, but to warn. Love without mercy becomes a curse." Local historians dismissed the find at first, claiming it was the work of an obsessed villager seeking attention. Yet the ink's age, the references to actual weather records, even the specific dates of the disappearances all aligned too perfectly to ignore. The church sealed the documents in a locked archive. The surviving pages that circulated in whispers among collectors became known as the Hale manuscripts, but one record, a church ledger entry, offered the final note. August 9th, 1008, 138, burial granted for Eveline Ward, age 29, no family remaining, cause of death, decline of spirit. Beneath it, in fainter handwriting, another line had been added later, as if by a trembling hand. Jonas Hale presumed missing, grave unmarked, body never recovered. No one knows who wrote that last sentence. But even now, on certain nights when the air is heavy with rain, locals say the river behind the old Ward property carries whispers. A man's voice repeating a woman's name, not crying it, but chanting it, soft and unending, as if still praying to something that no longer hears. After the discovery of the Hale manuscripts, the parish summoned surviving townsfolk to provide accounts, an attempt to calm the unease that had begun to choke Ravenshade Hollow. Their recollections, preserved in fragments within a 1840 church report, were meant to restore reason. Instead, they deepened the fear. The first to speak was Agnes Lorne, who had once worked as a housekeeper for the wards. Her voice trembled as she recalled the nights when Eveline's window glowed, though no candle burned. "It weren't flame," she said, "but a pulse, like the light of a heart seen through skin." She claimed to have heard a man's voice, gentle at first, then broken, whispering outside the walls. He'd say her name, slow and quiet, till the dogs began to wail. Reverend Morley followed. A thin, sickly man by then, he testified that Jonas Hale had visited him weeks before his disappearance, bringing with him a sealed envelope and a strange request that it be buried beneath Eveline's grave. When asked what the letter contained, the Reverend answered, "I did not open it, but the paper bled through with rust, and when I held it to the candlelight, I swear the ink moved. Several villagers spoke of seeing Jonas wandering the fields near the river after dusk. His clothes were soaked, his hands blackened with silt. He carried a small wooden box, sometimes pressing it to his chest, as though to keep it from crying. None dared approach. He'd look at you as if he recognized you from a dream you'd rather forget," said one. Then came Mrs. Ada Thorne, who had tended Eveline's grave for a month after she was buried. She said, "I found lilies laid on her mound, fresh, though the fields were frozen. They were never there at dawn, only by the time the church bell rang 9, but they weren't whole flowers. They'd been split down the stem and tied together again, like something mended but not right." By the time the testimonies ended, even the scribe refused to continue writing. The minutes stop abruptly with the words, "The congregation requests this inquiry be sealed for fear it invites what it seeks to name." Still, whispers persisted. The riverbank where Jonas had often stood grew barren, grass refused to root. Cattle crossing the low fields balked and shuddered, and one spring the water turned cloudy with something like ash. A traveling physician, Dr. W.P. Wexler, came through Ravenshade in 1008, 142 to collect soil and blood samples, claiming to investigate environmental miasmas. He found nothing he could name, but in his personal notes, later unearthed, he wrote, "There is illness here not of the body. The people avoid mirrors, the air hangs with memory. Whatever passed between that man and woman was not buried. It lingers, alive in absence." The villagers began to leave, one household at a time. By the winter of 1008, 144, Ravenshade's church bells had fallen silent, their ropes stiff with mildew. Dr. William Percival Wexler arrived in Ravenshade with the detached curiosity of a scholar, and left as a man visibly hollowed by what he had seen. His journals, preserved in the Morley archive, detail a series of medical investigations that began as rational inquiry and devolved into something neither scientific nor sane. He set up his workspace in the old parish morgue, a cold stone chamber beneath the vestry that had once held the bodies of drowned field hands and fever victims. The villagers, few that remained, warned him of the noise beneath. A faint rhythmic tapping said to come from the drains after midnight. Wexler dismissed it as air trapped in rusted pipes. His stated purpose was to analyze soil and water from the ward property, yet his attention soon drifted toward Eveline herself. He exhumed her remains under clerical authorization, claiming the cause of decline needed clearer classification for public record. The coffin, he wrote, had not decayed, the wood was slick as if newly cut. When the lid was lifted, the scent was not of rot but iron. Wexler recorded that Eveline's skin bore a faint translucence, as if death had attempted to mimic life but failed in texture. Her fingers were crossed upon her chest, but between them lay something the gravedigger swore had not been placed there, a folded scrap of paper pressed into the bone. On it, written in faint, trembling lines, "He waits where the water bends." The phrase obsessed him. Within a week he began nightly visits to the river. In his notes dated March 3rd, 1842, he describes seeing motion below the current, parallel to the flow, not fish, not reflection, but rhythm. He collected jars of river mud, noting the presence of thin filaments resembling human hair. When burned, the residue released a scent he identified as lavender and ash. His assistant, a young clerk named Nolan Pritchard, refused to continue after hearing whispers from the samples themselves. Wechsler dismissed the claim until his own report changed tone. Tonight the glass trembled without touch. The mud rose like breath drawn through water. There was shape in it, a profile, soft, dissolving. I do not believe in spirits, but I do believe in persistence. His final experiment was to submerge a lamb's heart in the same water overnight. By morning, the jar was clear, the organ intact yet when lifted. It pulsed once in his palm and went still again. He sealed the morgue that day. His last written words were scrawled across the back of a chart. "She is not gone. She is becoming." Weeks later, Reverend Morley found the morgue door open. The lantern inside still burned, its wick untouched. The walls were wet, as though the room had inhaled river water. There was no sign of Wechsler or Pritchard. Only the jars remained empty, their lids rusted shut from the inside. In the summer of 1844, Ravenshade Hollow suffered the worst flood in its recorded history. The river that wound through the valley, once narrow, sluggish, and brown, rose with unnatural speed, swallowing fences, grave markers, and entire portions of the ward property. The locals called it the Waking. The parish records describe a noise like breathing through reeds, preceding the first collapse of the bank. Witnesses claimed that hours before the storm began, the air had already changed, the scent of iron thickened, and the clouds did not roll but hung, and moving, gravid with something more than rain. By dusk, the river had broken its path. It surged toward the village square, dragging with it earth, branches, and what some swore were human shapes not floating, but walking just beneath the surface, their heads turned upward as though listening. Mrs. Ada Thorne, the church-keeper, left the most detailed account. She had remained inside the chapel to protect the relics when she heard the first cry. It weren't thunder, she told the record clerk later. It was speech, the sound of many throats choking the same name. That name, she said, was Eveline. Windows shattered inward, though the wind blew the other way. The bells, which had not rung in 2 winters, began to sway on their own. Their toll was uneven, half swallowed by the storm, yet between each note came another sound, rhythmic, deliberate, the same tapping once heard beneath the morgue. By nightfall, the lower half of Ravenshade lay under water. Those who fled toward the high road reported seeing figures along the current, half formed, moving in pairs. A man leading a woman by the hand, her gown trailing like a veil of silt. One farmer swore that when lightning struck the steeple, the reflection in the flood showed 2 churches, one of stone, one of bone. At dawn, the water receded as quickly as it had risen. The damage was catastrophic, yet eerily selective. The old ward estate was gone, entirely swallowed, but the church itself remained standing, untouched except for a single watermark running up the altar steps, as if the flood had paused there. The only object left on the altar was a single page, soaked through but still legible. It appeared to have been torn from Dr. Wechsler's journal. If flesh can remember, then water is its memory. It carries her voice, still patient, unending. The dead do not rest where they are buried, but where they are wanted. The villagers who stayed behind said the air smelled of lavender for weeks afterward. They heard the bells continue to toll, though the ropes were long since gone, and when they peered into the river, it seemed to breathe, rising and falling, not with the wind, but with something deeper, slower, like sleep. 17 years after the flood that erased half of Ravenshade Hollow, the river grew restless again. It did not rise this time, not yet, but its sound changed. Those who lived near its banks swore it no longer flowed. It whispered. Children claimed to hear singing when they fetched water, a woman's lullaby repeating through the reeds. It began with the orphans. In the winter of 1,861, the parish opened a small home for war widows and their children. It was built near the old river path on land that had once belonged to the wards. The villagers warned the caretaker, Mrs. Kittrell, not to build there. She dismissed them, saying, "The past is only dangerous to those who believe it." For a while the house thrived. The children grew roses, sang hymns, and slept soundly. But by spring, whispers of strange behavior began to surface. The youngest ones, barely 6, were found murmuring in their sleep, speaking of the woman in the water. They drew circles on the walls, each enclosing a shape that looked like an open eye. At first, Mrs. Kittrell believed it was imagination. She scrubbed the drawings off every morning, yet by dusk they returned, etched in wet silt as though drawn by unseen hands. She started locking the water barrels, forbidding the children to play near the river. It made no difference. They began to wake drenched, as if they'd been submerged. Then came the night of the procession. A farmer passing near the orphanage saw what he described as a line of pale figures walking from the house toward the river, silent, calm, as though called by something. He ran to alert the village, and when they arrived, they found the doors open, the hearth cold, and no trace of the children. Only a trail of footprints led to the bank, stopping where the mud turned to water. The search lasted days. On the 4th morning, Mrs. Kittrell was found standing knee-deep in the shallows, alive but unresponsive, holding a handful of small bones. She whispered only one sentence, again and again. They wanted to go home. The water promised it would take them. When she was finally pulled away, they noticed something in the current. 10 shapes drifting just beneath the surface, each child clutching a river stone engraved with the same symbol, the open eye. The townsfolk filled the well, burned the orphanage, and moved the parish boundary uphill. But even now, when the moon is full and the mist curls low, the river gleams pale blue, as if lit from beneath. If one listens closely, the water still hums that lullaby, soft, wordless, and terribly familiar. They call it now the Mother's Song, and those who have heard it say it is not a melody of comfort, but of calling. When the last of the parish stones had been torn down and the riverbank fenced off, the townspeople told themselves the curse had ended. They said prayers over the buried well, nailed crosses to their doors, and forbade anyone to speak the ward name again. But silence does not end a haunting, it feeds it. The floodplain became wild again by 1,864. Reeds overtook the ruins, frogs and black herons nested where laughter had once echoed. Yet at night, when fog rolled thick across the hollow, faint lamplight appeared beneath the water's surface, soft, amber, and steady, like a candle burning behind glass. No wind disturbed it, no ripple dimmed it. It simply glowed, as if the drowned rooms below were still occupied. Those who lingered long enough said the glow shifted shape, sometimes forming the outline of a woman, bent, watching, waiting. Others claimed to see children's faces flicker in the depths, eyes open, mouths moving though no sound rose. In 1,866, a traveling surveyor named Alcott Gray recorded his own account in a notebook found years later in the archives at Milledgeville. "The water lies unnaturally still here. My horse refused to drink. I saw below the surface, perhaps 10 feet down, what seemed a table set for supper plates. Silver and 3 small chairs, but when I blinked, There was nothing. I fear this place remembers too much. He vanished 2 days later. Only his boots were found at the bank, arranged neatly side by side. By the turn of the century, the parish records listed the hollow as abandoned territory. No one farmed the land, no one claimed it, yet every decade or so something returned. A sound, a light, a stranger drawn to the river without reason. In 1901, a schoolteacher who had taken residence in a nearby cottage wrote of hearing humming in the night, a lullaby that grew louder each time she ignored it. She followed it one evening and was found the next morning asleep beside the water, hands submerged, murmuring the words. They never stopped singing. She never taught again. Today, the land is private, fenced, and unmarked. Locals call it the Hollow of Eyes. If you visit after dark, you'll find the air unnaturally still, the insects gone quiet, the reflection of the moon broken as though the water breathes. Some say it is superstition. Others, those who have heard the lullaby on the wind, say it is the ward blood that keeps it alive, pulsing beneath the silt like a buried heart. And if you kneel by the riverbank, close enough to see your own reflection tremble, you might notice it blink, not in sync with you, but half a beat later. A whisper follows soon after, a woman's voice, tender and ancient, "Come home," then nothing, only silence, a silence so deep it feels like being watched from underneath.